Without a doubt, the question that I get asked the most is, what camera should I buy? And usually my response is the same. It depends. Let's dive a bit deeper into this. Full frame versus crop sensor, Sony versus Canon, new versus used. It's extremely confusing to know where to start as a beginner, and so in this video I'm gonna do my best to break down some of these terms, give my camera recommendations for 2024, and to just give you an overall better idea of what to look for when you're purchasing a camera. Before I get into specific cameras, I want to do a quick breakdown of how a camera actually works so that you know what I'm talking about when I reference certain parts of certain cameras. This is a camera body of an interchangeable lens camera. An interchangeable lens camera means, just like it sounds, you can change the lenses on the camera. These are camera lenses. More on them later in the video. This here is the camera's shutter curtain, and behind it, the camera's sensor. The way a camera works is that every time you press the shutter button to take a photo, light enters through the lens, that shutter curtain opens up for a split second, the light gets captured by the camera sensor, and the data gets stored on the camera's memory card. That is how a digital camera works. With a film camera, rather than there being a digital sensor there, there's actual film there. So every time you press the shutter button to take a photo, you're literally exposing that film to the light. Now, this digital camera here is what's called a mirrorless full frame camera. What the hell does that mean? Well, let's start with the term mirrorless. This is a DSLR camera and this is a mirrorless camera. The difference is that the DSLR camera has a mirror and the mirrorless camera does not. What does that mirror do exactly? Well, it allows you to see what you're shooting through the viewfinder of the camera by literally reflecting the light off that mirror. When you press the shutter, the mirror moves out of the way, exposing the sensor to the light. Well, hang on, if there's no mirror on the mirrorless cameras, then how do you see what you're shooting through the viewfinder? Mirrorless cameras have an electronic viewfinder, a tiny little screen that shows a digital display of what you're shooting. This is pretty handy because it allows you to see in real time what your image is going to look like when you change certain camera settings where the DSLR doesn't. It used to be the case that all professional cameras were DSLR cameras, but these days all camera manufacturers have stopped making DSLR cameras and are focused entirely on making new mirrorless cameras. In fact, most of you watching this video right now already have a mirrorless camera. One of these. For this reason, and there are others that I'll get into later in this video, I wouldn't recommend picking up a DSLR camera. I'd recommend just going straight into a mirrorless camera. Now back to the term full frame. This is a full frame camera and this is a crop sensor or an APS-C camera. The difference is the size of the sensor. A full frame sensor is a 35mm sensor, which is the size of a standard frame of 35mm film, hence the term full frame. A crop sensor is a smaller cropped version of a full frame sensor. There are advantages and disadvantages of both. Crop sensor cameras and lenses are cheaper than full frame ones, so beginners tend to gravitate towards crop sensors for that reason. Because the sensor in a full frame camera is bigger, it means that it lets in more light. This means that a full frame camera is better in low light situations, and it also means that you're gonna get an overall better image quality because you're just capturing more light data on that sensor. This is why professional photographers tend to gravitate towards full frame cameras. These higher quality photos, however, lead to bigger file sizes. Also, in addition to being more expensive, full frame cameras and lenses tend to be bigger and bulkier. These days, you can get really good quality photos out of both a crop sensor and a full frame camera, and I'll touch on this a little more later when I get to my personal camera recommendations. Now that we have a basic camera knowledge and vocabulary, let's get into some of the things to consider before picking up a camera. First things first, you need to figure out what you're gonna be using the camera for. Are you gonna be shooting primarily video, photo, or a little bit of both? For your photography, are you shooting landscapes? Are you shooting wildlife? Are you shooting sports? Some cameras are gonna be more video-centric cameras and some are gonna be more photo-centric cameras. And then there's gonna be cameras like mine that can do both, and we call them hybrid cameras. If you're shooting sports or wildlife, then the autofocus system in the camera is gonna matter a lot more than if you're shooting static landscapes, where you can probably get by with just manual focus. Obviously, the most important factor to consider before we even get to the cameras is budget. For that reason, I'm gonna give my camera recommendations in 3 different budget tiers. The first being somewhere in that $750 to $1,000 range, the second being somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000, and the third being pretty much anything above that. Keep in mind that I live in Canada, so these will be in Canadian dollars. If you have under $750 to spend on a camera, honestly, I would recommend just saving up a little more money to put yourself in this category. I know it sounds like a lot, but $750 to $1,000 is a really good starting point. Can you buy a camera for cheaper than this? Absolutely. In fact, my first camera was something like this Nikon D3400, and it cost me $400 on Marketplace. But if you're getting a camera this cheap, it's gonna be a pretty old crop sensor DSLR camera. The autofocus system is gonna be subpar, and the video capabilities are gonna be pretty slim. For these reasons, I would just stick with your smartphone until you have enough saved to get a solid mirrorless camera and a lens. Canon versus Sony versus Nikon. I've shot Nikon, I've shot Sony, and I even have a Canon camera as well now. Honestly, these days all cameras take amazing photos, so I wouldn't get too caught up in the brand of the camera when it comes to image quality. However, there are some benefits and drawbacks to each, so I'll give you my 2 cents. Canon color science is fantastic, no doubt, but my biggest beef with Canon is that they haven't opened their RF mount to third-party manufacturers. This means that third-party lens manufacturers like Sigma or Tamron can't make lenses for the RF mount system. So you're stuck with buying Canon's super high quality but super expensive lenses. Sony, on the other hand, has opened up their mounts to third-party lens manufacturers, so rather than spending $3,300 on this 100 to 400 lens, I was able to get a Sigma version for only $1,200. This is a huge thing to consider and something a lot of beginners fail to plan for. The camera is not the main money pit of photography, it's the lenses. You really only need one camera body, but you'll probably end up buying several camera lenses, so it's important to consider your lens options and the cost of those lenses when you buy your camera. This is another reason why I don't recommend buying a DSLR camera and just going straight into a mirrorless system. DSLR lenses are different than mirrorless lenses. Yes, they will work on a mirrorless camera with an adapter, but you will get a slight decrease in image quality when you use one of these adapters. It's also worth noting that full frame and crop sensor lenses are also different. You can use a full frame lens on a crop sensor camera body, and you're essentially just cropping into the frame. But if you start with a crop sensor camera and buy a bunch of crop lenses, well, now if you upgrade to a full frame camera later, those crop lenses won't really work with the full frame camera. Yes, full frame cameras like mine have a mode where you can turn it into crop mode and you can use those crop sensor lenses on the camera, but you're kind of just missing out on the point of using a full frame camera at that point. The reason I bring these things up is not to confuse you or to make your decision even more difficult, it's just to make you aware of some of these things. Because when I first started, I didn't know some of these things, and as a result, I ended up buying a crop sensor DSLR camera, I bought a bunch of lenses, and then later when I upgraded to a full frame camera in a different camera brand, I had to rebuy all of those lenses. Like I said earlier, it's the lenses that cost a lot of money, not the camera body. So if you start buying a bunch of lenses, it's gonna suck later if you switch to a different camera brand or a different camera system in general and you can't use any of those lenses. If I had known what I know now, I would have just started out with a really cheap Sony full frame mirrorless camera, started accumulating lenses, and then when I upgraded my camera later, all those lenses would have still worked on my camera. Which brings us to the point of the video you guys have been waiting for, my personal camera recommendations. On the lower end of the spectrum, cheapest of the cheap, if I had $750 to $1,000 to spend, I have 2 recommendations here. If you don't care about video at all, just photos, then the Sony a7 II you can pick up for around $750. Again, it doesn't shoot 4K, it only shoots 1080p. The autofocus system is okay, it's not great, but it gets you in that full frame mirrorless world so that you can now start accumulating lenses, and then later if you decide that you want to upgrade your camera to a newer Sony camera, all of those lenses will work. If you're firm on a camera that shoots photo and video, then you're looking at a crop sensor camera in this price range. I'd go with a Sony personally, so I'd be recommending an a6400, a6500, a6600, whatever you can get your hands on in that price range in your area on Marketplace. The only downside of these, like I said before, is that they're a crop sensor camera. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, Chris, can I trust Marketplace? How do I know if a camera is good quality if I buy it used? Well, I have two answers to this. The first, do your research. There's tons of checklists online that go through the things to check out when you're buying a camera used on Marketplace. So just make sure that you go through that checklist and you actually test out the camera before you buy it. If you have a friend who knows anything about cameras, it's always best to bring them with you when you're buying a used camera. If you still don't feel comfortable buying a camera used on Marketplace, then make sure to check online to see if there's any camera stores in your area that have a used market. All right, this next tier is where you're gonna see a huge step up in quality, functionality, everything really, this $1,000 to $2,000 range. On the crop sensor side of things, the newly released a6700 looks like an amazing hybrid camera. Again, it's a crop sensor, so you'll have to decide if you want to upgrade your lenses later if you start with a crop sensor. On the full frame side, without a doubt, I would recommend the Sony a7 III. This is the revolutionary hybrid camera that kind of changed the game of this class of camera. The image quality is fantastic, the video is amazing, and you can easily find one on Marketplace in this price range. On the higher end of the price spectrum, there are really endless options. I'm currently using the Sony a7 IV, which is being used to shoot this video, and it's the successor to the Sony a7 III that I recommended in the previous tier. This thing shoots awesome photos, amazing videos, I can't recommend it enough. There's the Sony FX series, which is the Sony cinema cameras if you're really into shooting videos. The Canon R6 is another really solid hybrid camera. The new Sony ZV-E1, a little more expensive, but the Canon R5. In this price point, you really have endless options and can get all the features that you want in a camera. But honestly, this is not the price range that I would recommend most people get a camera if you're getting into the camera game. I mean, unless you just have a bunch of cash just burning a hole in your pocket, then go ahead, buy an expensive camera. Or if this isn't your first camera and you're upgrading, that makes a lot of sense. But if you're looking to buy your first camera, then I would definitely recommend buying from one of the first two tiers and then using the remainder of whatever budget you have left to buy a solid lens. Now, I'm not gonna get into lenses as that's another video in its entirety, but the lens that you put in front of your camera makes the biggest difference when it comes to image quality. The analogy that I like to think of is the impact of diet and weight training on fat loss. 80% of the battle is diet, 20% exercise. The impulse for most people to lose body fat is to just do a bunch of cardio and sit-ups. They want that six-pack. But unfortunately, that's just not how it works. The same can be said with cameras and lenses. Most people want to spend all their money on a dope camera with all the features and then buy a cheap lens because they spent all their money on the camera body. But 80% of the image quality comes from the lens. So you kind of have to work backwards a bit. Define what your use case is for the camera, figure out what lens you need to accomplish that goal, how much that lens costs, and then use the remainder of your money to buy the camera body. I hope this has been helpful for you guys. If you do want to see another video like this dedicated specifically to camera lenses, then let me know in the comments below. Also, if you're not already, consider subscribing. It really does help spread these videos to other people like you who can benefit from them. I'll see you guys in the next one.